Hey RC enthusiasts, this is part 2 of a little talk about how to set up a shaft-driven vehicle for maximum performance, trailing and hill climbing and jumping around and bashing and whatnot. If you've gotten this far, if you're watching this video, you must have watched the other one, I hope, and wanted to know more, wanted to know a few more details. Setting up a chassis, a lot of it's going to be dependent on the shell you choose. This is just a weird little RC shell from Radio's Jack called a Rat 500. I think it's like a $40 RC car. That's where the shell was donated from there. And I just fitted around a Vanquish Products comp chassis, which I think you can see the plates inside. Comp chassis for AX10 are traditionally plates which go to a skid. Okay, notice the double shear mounting for all that, and how it's profiled so that everything goes over it. And when you're setting up an old style AX10 comp crawler, like for sportsman class crawling, you don't want big long shocks like this, and you don't want a lot of suspension travel. These were traditionally very flat, very low, with limited articulation in general. And so what I've done is I've taken these longer shocks, I've modified them using clicky pen springs, you know, from like a clicky ballpoint pen, and I've put a section of spring inside the shock so it limits the upward travel and dampens it. Okay, see how it comes back? It forces it to droop. Okay, because this is an old style chassis plate from back in the beginning of sportsman class crawling. It has a setup for really long shocks, much longer than people use today for comp crawling. So this is sort of a throwback, and so these shocks do fit it in terms of geometry, but they give you way too much articulation. Another way of taking up a little articulation is to use a smaller, like low CT spring, and then you end up with 3 or 4 millimeters of stop that way, and the same inside because of the spring inside. So you've limited the overall height and travel of your shock with this mod. I've got a video on that. When you're setting up your chassis, you want to think about forward weight bias if you're talking four-wheeling and you're talking trying to go up a hill, trying to climb anything, or if you want to get teeter-tottered onto like a big log and you want to rock forward. So this is set up with forward weight bias. The balance point for this chassis is right here. Now I made my front links a lot longer than I usually do. I usually do it the other way around. I put long rear links with relatively upright shocks and then short front links with the shocks more angled so I get more articulation, and then that's how I've been doing it with my motor on axle. But with the shafty, what I've been finding is that because of the radical amount of torque twist, the vehicle just wants to torque and lift up the front wheel, your best bet is to go with short rear links and longer front links, at least for my setup. I've got no weights per se on the axle, but I do have a fair chunk of aluminum up here. This is just my own thing because of the way this vehicle is. There's no way to have a bumper on the actual chassis rails. There are no chassis rails. The shell doesn't afford any protection whatsoever. So I had to protect the servo from getting smashed directly and all that into things. And this has been working out great for me. I also put a light on it. But this is not something you necessarily need to do. But I just did it, and it's worked out for me because of this particular odd little shell, which is relatively short. It's about 12.5 inches, and the whole vehicle with tires on it is about 17.5 inches. So if you were running a more scale shell, you'd probably be running an 8th scale giant body on it. And at that point, the vehicle would be very top-heavy, very heavy. This shell is very light. This whole thing is about 3 pounds, 2.7 ounces, what I'm holding in my hand. Each tire weighs about 6 ounces. Once you add in the wheel weights, the axle wideners, which are kind of like weights. Once you add in these axle wideners and you have everything put on, it chunks it up with no battery to about 4 pounds, 12.8 ounces. Okay, what I'm finding is ideal for something that you want to be able to throw around without breaking parts. Okay, you want to be able to run a 35 turn brushed motor, brushed ESC, something cheap like a Hobby Wing Quick Run 1060. So you got a cheap, durable setup that's not going to fall apart on you, with this regular old axial transmission with the 48P teeth, 87 tooth spur. The spur is the big black gear inside there. The pinion is the shinier gear here. Mine's 22 tooth, which is very, very high. Usually people gear, 16, 18, maybe 20. This is 22. The motor does get hot if you run it continuously. So you just run it in a little burst, take a little break, run it in a little burst. When you're just crawling around at relatively low speeds, it does not get hot, but if you're blasting around and lofting over things and jumping and trailing and spinning and drifting, it does get hot, but not. My test is to hold my finger against it for 5 seconds. If I can hold it for 5 seconds without going, ow, it's okay. If I put my finger on it, I have to take my finger right off of it, it's too hot. Okay, the ESC never gets hot. Okay, another thing about this particular shell is it just lends itself to running LiPo packs. In the back, this is a really stout pack. This thing is relatively heavy. It's about 7.3 ounces in and of itself, so it's even heavier than one of the tires. If I run a smaller pack, okay, which is about half the weight, okay, and I put this pack opposite this big chunk of a motor over here, my center balance, if you balance your vehicle by holding it basically in either diff and just look if it tips this way or this way, that's the pivot point, it's very neutral. That is the perfect size battery for this vehicle. Gives me about 20 minutes of run time, which is usually plenty, which won't burn up the motor. But when I want to get out and trail longer, here's a double size battery, and when I put that in there, then it definitely wants to tip to this side. A way to keep the neutral weight balance is there's also a place in this shell that I can mount it back here. This is what you look at when you're looking at shells, is how can I use this shell to my advantage? So to me, it allowed me to get the battery low, and to me, having the battery as low as possible right here and as central as possible without altering the front back bias was more important than the side-to-side bias. But you don't have to use a big battery. You can use a little battery and just change them out all the time, which is what I've done for a long time. So here's the other little bit of knowledge I've learned. When you're setting something up like this, where you want to be able to clear things, but you still want to stay low enough that you can do side hilling, you can climb straight up, you can get over things without turtling, you're going to want your suspension on an AX10 type vehicle or a shaft-driven vehicle to be very flat. If it's this kind of a 4-link type suspension, you're not using an SX10 chassis, you're using a comp crawler type chassis with the intention of just blasting around with it. It's got to be relatively flat. As you can see, my front links are almost perfectly flat into the skid, and my back links just come out just a little bit. But it gives me a little bit of a stink bug type stance, as they would say, with the ass end of the vehicle up. And what this does is it lets you hop. So you have to learn to drive every vehicle. Once you set it up and tuned it, you can tune it back and forth, trying to look for ways of strengthening the vehicle versus your own weakness as being a good driver, right? Or you can learn to drive the vehicle looking for its strengths and alter your driving style to go for its strengths. So the strengths with a shaft-driven vehicle like this is just infinite amounts of grip and torque at all times. All four wheels always spinning all the time. And instead of looking to be finessing it, you can oftentimes just root right through things. Just give it a little throttle, hop over something, leap over something, blast through something, drift a little bit, you know. And to be able to do that, you got to have the back of the vehicle relatively light, the front of the vehicle relatively heavy, but not so much so that when you hit the brakes, you end up flipping over. And the last thing to do is, I think when you're looking for a shell, okay, it doesn't have to be this one. It could be any type of shell. It could be a Jeep shell, or a Bronco shell, or a pickup truck shell, or a short course body, or even a comp crawling shell. Is you just want to see what it's going to do to hinder or help you. So with this, because it's so short, obviously the tires are going to make contact well before the shell does, almost all the time. And because of its sort of truncated tetrahedral type pyramidal shape, it wants to fall towards the wheels. Because of its forward weight bias, it doesn't want to stay on the roof. So all these things make this shell work really well for when you're tumbling around, you flipped, you want to get back up, things like that. That's another thing to look for when you're thinking about clothing your comp crawler chassis. So I don't know how interesting this was to anybody. You guys let me know in the comments if you like this kind of knowledge. I can go on and on.